We all know how sanitized mainstream Black history has become.
Martin Luther King Jr., now he was a kumbaya preacher man. Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She didn't get up because her feet were hurting. Can you blame her? Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Everybody loved Muhammad Ali.
Turns out that this remixed retelling of Black history is doing more harm than good. Today's baggage? Whitewashing Black history. Over the years, what we've come to refer to as Black history isn't a true and full history of Black people in the United States. The reality is that much of this history has been misused, whitewashed, led astray. One glaring example is the way we learn about American slavery in public schools. Long story short, it ain't cutting it. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, only 8% of surveyed high school students knew that slavery was a primary cause of the Civil War. And 68% of them didn't know that it took a constitutional amendment to put an end to the practice. With findings like these, it's no surprise that the way Black history is taught in schools is a little shaky. While some states have laws requiring Black history be taught in K through 12, only 7 states out of the entire US of A have actual committees to enforce them. But beyond the classroom, celebrating and acknowledging our Black history is something that many confine to merely a month. I'm talking 28 days, 29 if we're lucky. How, Sway?
How, Sway?
And because we so often incorrectly learn the Mickey Mouse versions of Black freedom struggles of yesteryear, it's no wonder modern day movements are pitted against that false narrative. Just take a look at the Civil Rights Movement. Civil rights history, as we learn it, highlights a handful of prominent leaders who struggled in the South, but through peaceful protest and perseverance were victorious. But something tells me there's more to the story. I spoke with Theo Harris, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College. Her research focuses on civil rights and Black power movements. She says what we know as civil rights history is a tall tale. Professor Theo Harris, you refer to the history of the civil rights movement as a fable. Why is this?
Part of what I talk about is the ways that a particular version of the history of the civil rights movement has become kind of crucial to the way that the United States talks about itself. And I argue it begins when Ronald Reagan's long opposition to a federal holiday for Dr. King shifts because they see a political value now in supporting the holiday. And when he does that, he talks about a couple of key things. It's putting the movement in the past, so we had this struggle, and then we took pains to correct it. The second is it's about courageous individuals, and particularly King and Parks. But I would argue also stripped of who they were and what they actually stood for. And the third thing is it becomes a notion of American exceptionalism. So Reagan says, in many countries, people like Dr. King wouldn't get to speak out at all.
Would you consider then this fable to sort of be a whitewashing?
Yes. In many of the ways that we tell the story of the civil rights movement is that it's angry and hateful and spitting and burning crosses. And certainly that was part of the opposition to the civil rights movement. But some of the other opposition to the civil rights movement came in much politer means, but still means that people took to, for instance, make sure that school desegregation didn't happen in a city like New York City.
Civil rights history also places the movement in the South, but Black folks were knee-deep in the freedom struggle across the country. In fact, the largest protest in civil rights history wasn't the March on Washington. It was in New York City in 1964. Nearly 500,000 students and teachers stayed out of school to protest the city's lack of a desegregation plan. Y'all, this is 10 years after the Brown v. Board of Education decision said that separate was not equal. Yet, somehow this protest often doesn't make it into the textbooks.
I think a second kind of whitewashing is making it seem like people like Dr. King were embraced sort of in his lifetime. When Dr. King faced relentless death threats, he faced relentless heckling, not just in the South, but in the North. In 1966, 3/4 of Americans said they didn't approve of what he was doing and his tactics, right? Dr. King believed in disruption. You had to bring the injustice to the surface. You had to make it uncomfortable. Similar to how activists today Black Lives Matter activists, climate activists, immigration activists understand that until people are made uncomfortable, many, many people are going to allow injustice to continue.
In the process of pitting King's protest against groups like Black Lives Matter, the complexity of his legacy gets misconstrued.
When Dr. Martin Luther King and Ambassador Andrew Young and Ralph David Abernathy marched in protest, they didn't just go run on a freeway.
Brother, please.
They somehow have made a king that didn't believe in disrupting business as usual, when in fact, even if we think about where Dr. King starts with the Montgomery bus boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott was a disruptive consumer boycott. It was meant to bring the city of Montgomery to its knees.
And Martin Luther King Jr. isn't the only leader whose legacy is now domesticated.
Rosa Parks is arguably one of the most honored Americans today. And yet what we know about her traps her on the bus when she was a lifelong freedom fighter.
Theo Harris says that Parks, who was 42 at the time of her arrest, also worked on police brutality and political prisoner issues. Beyond that, she also stood for expanded affordable housing and reparations. Hell, Parks believed in Black power, self-defense, and even referred to Malcolm X as her hero. In sum, Rosa Parks was about that life. Professor Theo Harris says another way Black history gets whitewashed is when we remove the risks often associated with protest.
We like to imagine that all of us would have done it if we were there at the time. And I think we forget how hard it was to do, what it took to actually do what, for instance, the young people of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee actually did, how they were often opposed by their parents. Many of them were in college. Many colleges, including historically Black colleges, opposed young people being active in the sit-ins or in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
History isn't mistold or forgotten just when we talk about a handful of civil rights leaders. It extends to athletes too. Muhammad Ali, previously known as Cassius Clay, was a fierce boxer who famously spoke out against the Vietnam War.
I will not go 10,000 miles from here to help murder and kill another poor people simply to continue the domination of white slave masters over the darker people.
Ali lost his heavyweight title for refusing the draft and was considered anti-American. It was even said that Muhammad Ali was the most hated man in the world at the time. Fast forward a couple of decades and folks love them some Muhammad Ali.
But when you say the greatest of all time is in the room, everyone knows who you mean.
Please. When it comes to the history of revolutionary Black athletes, I wouldn't be surprised if history repeated itself. And y'all know who I'm talking about, Colin Kaepernick. In 2016, the former 49er took a stand against police brutality by taking a knee during the national anthem. 4 years after the protest, the QB is still unsigned.
So many of the reactions that people have had to Kaepernick, people had to Ali in the 60s. Even though Kaepernick, the NFL, and many Americans continue to disparage Kaepernick's stand, disparage his political convictions, I feel certain whether it's in 20 years or 40 years or 80 years, we're going to see the same thing.
In short, when it comes to actually grappling with all that Black history consists of, America needs to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Why don't the writers of history want us to know these critical stories?
In the past number of decades, we have seen a tremendous flowering of research on all sorts of aspects of African American history and the Black freedom struggle sort of over the past 400 years. The title of my book is drawn from this amazing quote by James Baldwin. And James Baldwin says, "American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything that anyone has ever said about it." And I think this sort of captures the sort of history we need, right? Which is, it's longer, it's bigger, it's much harder and more sobering, but it's also more beautiful. And I think sometimes we miss that aspect as well.
The fact is that this country doesn't want to confront the true history of the United States. After all, it's ugly, and it would require a reckoning of a not so great country, a history that's mired in hate and fear. It's time that we tell the truth about who we are and where we come from. Because Black history is American history.